The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. These facts few psychologists will dispute, and their admitted truth must establish for all time the genuineness and dignity of the weirdly horrible tale as a literary form. Against it are discharged all the shafts of a materialistic sophistication which clings to frequently felt emotions and external events, and of a naively insipid idealism which depreciates the aesthetic motive and calls for a didactic literature to uplift the reader toward a suitable degree of smirking optimism. But in spite of all this opposition, the weird tale has survived, developed, and attained remarkable heights of perfection. Founded as it is on a profound and elementary principle whose appeal, if not always universal, must necessarily be poignant and permanent to minds of the requisite sensitiveness. That is from H.P. Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature. Supernatural Horror in Literature, written by H.P. Lovecraft, an essay written by H.P. Lovecraft that covers the history of supernatural and horror literature up to his own time, and has found a place in the history of supernatural and horror literature. Because it's pretty important. It's a pretty important essay. It still makes very good reading today if you're interested in supernatural horror. Because he has some very interesting insights into supernatural horror up to his time, the early 30s, when he finally finished his essay. At the time when he was hired to write this, he decided to reread a bunch of classics that he had already read, and he discovered a bunch of other authors that he had never heard of. And all of that couldn't help, all of this reading in supernatural literature couldn't help but affect his own writing. And ideas from the stories that he was reading seeped into his own stories. So it's pretty important just for that. But it's also very important just as a scholarly piece of research, something that we can refer to and look back on. And you can find a lot of value in reading it now, because a lot of the stuff that he covers, a lot of it's kind of been forgotten by a lot of people. I will read you just the bit that scholar and H.P. Lovecraft expert S.T. Joshi has to say on this work. Lovecraft was asked to write this essay by his friend, W. Paul Cook, who was planning an amateur magazine, not specifically devoted to weird fiction, although in the end it featured contributions by Donald Wandrei, H. Warner Munn, and others, entitled The Recluse. Lovecraft began the essay in late 1925 and completed it in early 1927. The one and only issue of The Recluse appeared in the summer of 1927. Almost immediately thereafter, Lovecraft began assembling notes for a revised edition. He finally got a chance to prepare a revised edition when Charles W. Hornig wished to serialize the text in his fan magazine, The Fantasy Fan. The serialization began with the October 1933 issue and was not completed when the Fantasy Fan folded in February 1935. Subsequently, Lovecraft added a section on William Hope Hodgson, designed to be inserted into Chapter 9. The complete revised text was first included in The Outsider and Others, 1939. But the first textually sound and annotated edition appeared with the annotated Supernatural Horror in Literature that was published in the year 2000. So, there you go. That's a little history of the piece. But what's really interesting is what is in the essay. It's in 10 little chapters. It's a relatively short essay. It doesn't take long to read, but has some short chapters here. Has chapter 1 is the introduction. Chapter 2 is the dawn of the horror tale. Chapter 3 is the early Gothic novel. So he goes over all your old Gothic favorites like Anne Radcliffe. The apex of Gothic romance. The aftermath of Gothic fiction. And he has some interesting things to say in that section on Wuthering Heights. He considers Wuthering Heights a tale of terror. He believed it was a supernatural horror story in its own way. I kind of agree with his thinking on that. And then in chapter 6 we get spectral literature on the continent. Chapter 7 he has a whole chapter on Edgar Allan Poe, and it's pretty interesting, his thoughts on Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was his favorite author of all time. Easy to see Edgar Allan Poe's influence on Lovecraft, although Lovecraft stories usually are very different from Poe's stories. He was coming from a different place. He was writing about different things. He had a different focus in his stories than Edgar Allan Poe did. Nevertheless, he loved Edgar Allan Poe. And you can clearly see the influence of Edgar Allan Poe, particularly in some of H.P. Lovecraft's earlier stories. Okay, and then number 8, chapter 8, we have the weird tradition in America. Chapter 9, the weird tradition in the British Isles. And that, of course, is where he inserts his William Hope Hodgson chapter. I've got the complete works of William Hope Hodgson hiding behind Justin from this Just In and myself. But I have all of his collected fiction up there, and I'm going to start reading that next year and talking about it with you fine folks. But yeah, Hodgson's pretty important, and Lovecraft has some interesting things to say about him. Then we get the Modern Masters, which is the final chapter. The Modern Masters. Now, the Modern Masters, when he was alive, were his favorite writers of all, other than Edgar Allan Poe. He talks about Arthur Machen. He has a lot of interesting insights into the fiction of Arthur Machen. Machen, of course, the famous Welsh writer of horror who wrote The Great God Pan and a bunch of other stuff, 3 Impostors he wrote. You should read this guy's work. And he had a huge influence on Lovecraft. Yeah, a great influence on Lovecraft. And also he talks about Algernon Blackwood, another writer who had a tremendous influence on Lovecraft. Lovecraft considered the Willows to be the finest weird tale of all. Kind of hard to argue that, particularly at the time that this essay was written. Up to that point, I would agree The Willows probably was the greatest weird tale of all. He also talks about Lord Dunsany, Lord Dunsany was a fantasy writer, not really a horror writer, although you can definitely see the supernatural in Dunsany's tales, that's for sure. His fantastic fantasies about strange gods and odd happenings. I recommended Lord Dunsany a couple times in a couple different videos recently. And yeah, he goes into Lord Dunsany because Dunsany, like I said, had a huge influence on Lovecraft. Lovecraft wrote a lot of stories that were directly influenced by Dunsany, and they're pretty clear to see. And he also talks about M.R. James, the great ghost story writer M.R. James, probably the greatest writer of ghost stories ever. And he wrote a bunch of other horrifying tales that aren't really about ghosts. You got a bunch of other creepy things that are crawling around in M.R. James tales. Great horror writer. Not enough people read him. Lovecraft has a lot to say about him too. And he talks about all of these guys in a relatively short little essay. And particularly the earlier chapters when he's talking about the dawn of the horror tale, the early Gothic novels, stuff like that, you're going to find writers and pieces of literature that you might not have heard of. Pieces of literature that have been all throughout supernatural horror and literature. There are pieces that he talks about that have since been forgotten. Even the modern masters, who I talk about quite a bit there are horror readers out there who don't know who these modern masters, former modern masters, are, which is kind of sad. That there are horror readers out there who aren't aware of Machen or Blackwood or James. It seems incredible, but true. So definitely they should all read this essay. It's entertaining. You hear essay and maybe you're like, maybe I don't want to read that. Yeah, you do. It's a pretty important piece of work. Supernatural horror in literature. Like I said, you could find it in a few different places. You could find it right here if you've got the Barnes & Noble edition. Great edition to have because there's a ton of stuff in this book. But again, if you've got if you're into the ebooks and read the ebooks on the e-readers, like all you modern kids do, you can get it pretty easily. Just like you can get a lot of Lovecraft pretty easily. So yeah, just wanted to talk a little bit about supernatural horror in literature, seeing as we are going into the Halloween season, the greatest time of the year, the only holiday that really matters, Halloween. So thought I would talk about it here. Tomorrow, catch me tomorrow, I don't have a tag. And I don't have a tag for a couple of reasons, which I'll go into tomorrow. What? Do you really want to tag that bad? Hey, I'll do a tag next week. I promise I will, okay, little one? I'll do a tag next week, and it'll be lots of fun, okay? Little friend. Okay, now, you have a good day, and don't, terrify me anymore. Okay, yeah. So anyway, I'll go into why I don't have a tag tomorrow, because tomorrow, basically I realized that the year is running out, and there are only a couple months left in the year. So I have to go over my plans for the next couple months. That's coming tomorrow. So I will catch you next time.